evening, comrades. Welcome to the latest session in our new education series, Lives of the Left. We've already looked at a few important socialists from our past, and we'll be looking at a few more in the next few weeks. The program online isn't quite updated yet, but it will. I hear somebody's doing Karl Liebknecht soon. We'll update it as soon as possible on the website. Tonight we're looking at James Connolly, sorry, James Connolly, who played a leading role in the Easter Rising in Ireland, was actually born in Scotland and even lived in America. So he had a very interesting and eventful life with various jobs in between, etc. So very pleased to welcome Kevin Bean, who's organized most of these sessions. So we're very much looking forward to this. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Good evening, comrades. I suppose that most people in the British Labour movement are familiar with the name of James Connolly. He's one of those figures that when we first come into the Labour movement and perhaps start to read and think about it, his name crops up. It may be that some comrades have read some of his pamphlets. He has got an extensive bibliography of pamphlets and articles that were particularly directed towards ordinary workers who were coming into contact with socialist ideas for the first time. Or we may know about his role in the Easter Rising of 1916. The centenary of that rising wasn't so long ago. Or we may be familiar with his role in the various countries that Tina talked about. But there are a couple of other things that I think we should know about him, and some really, I think, interesting and indeed inspiring aspects of his life and his politics, but also something of the debate about Connolly and maybe his contemporary significance. As Tina said, Connolly was born in Glasgow. He was born to Irish parents in 1868. He lived in one of the poorest districts of Glasgow, the Cowgate area, not that far from the city centre, but like many areas at that time in the big cities in Britain, inhabited by large numbers of fairly poor Irish immigrants, often fleeing essentially from poverty, and only 20 or so years before Connolly's birth, the famine of the 1840s. So he grew up in fairly straitened circumstances and left school somewhere around about 10 or 11 years old. And I see a comrade is on from Edinburgh, so I hope a comrade there will come in and give us some details about the walks you can do around Edinburgh to see Connolly's life, or where he lived and so on. But he lived in fairly straitened circumstances, left school at about 10 or 11, and went to work in various jobs. Significantly for our purposes, or for I think his significance, is that he is from the working class. Indeed, I'd say from the very lowest strata of the working class. So he's not particularly from a skilled workers background, and indeed many of the very hard conditions that working class people faced in the late 19th and early 20th century, he was intimately familiar with. Somewhere in his teens, it's rather sketchy, and we can see the obvious reasons for that. He joined the British Army, again a fairly common route for many people. It would be a way out of poverty. Served in Ireland, in a Scottish regiment in Ireland, but deserted somewhere around the 1890s, around about 1890. He joined the army under an assumed name, and I suppose had that sort of fear hanging over him for most of his life that he might be arrested on charges of desertion. In the early 1890s, he came into contact with socialist ideas, and those ideas are very much those of the Social Democratic Federation, which at that point is the major Marxist organization, or at least it portrays itself as a Marxist organization in Britain. It's quite strong in some of the larger cities, and Connolly's Marxism and Connolly's politics are, I think, very much influenced by the Social Democratic Federation. He's particularly influenced by one of its leading organizers, John Leslie, and that sort of mark is going to stay on him for the rest of his life. But there's also another element in Connolly's politics which will come to the fore in the 1890s, when he starts to look more closely at what we might think of as the Irish question. It's clear from both his own memoirs and indeed from what we know of Scottish politics at that time, that the Irish populations of the big cities in Scotland and indeed in the rest of Britain, in England and Wales and so forth, were often mobilized around Irish questions, particularly the idea of home rule, form of self-government for Ireland, or even forms of independence, and the idea of an independent republic, and indeed of militant separatism. Although in the 1860s there had been some connections between the socialist movement and those campaigning or fighting for Irish independence, there had been something of a tendency by the 1890s for that movement for Irish self-government to be very much in the hands of bourgeois nationalists. And what I think is interesting about Connolly's earliest work is that he looks at that relationship. He looks at the relationship between bourgeois nationalism and the working class, and develops a critique of that nationalism, arguing that it's only really the working class that's the only class that genuinely wants real national independence and real freedom. And that idea of a critique of bourgeois nationalism is very strong in Connolly's politics. And indeed, some of his sharpest and sort of pithiest writing is from this period. A piece from this early period in which he talks about the way that if Ireland became independent, it would still be ruled by capitalism, is almost something of a motto for Irish socialists. He makes the point, he says that if you remove the British Army, if you put up the green flag over Dublin Castle, the central government in Ireland, then Britain would, or England to use the older form, would still rule you through our capitalists and through our banks. So he identified British rule with capitalism and indeed with imperialist exploitation. And also, of course, he increasingly identified the bourgeois nationalists as people who would want independence for Ireland, but did not want to change the social structure. And indeed, in the later period, again, he will reserve some of his sharpest critiques for these Irish nationalists who essentially want to preserve private property, who want to preserve the social order, but simply want limited forms of self-government. And he comes into conflict with those, particularly William Martin Murphy, who he will do battle with during the Great Lockout of 1913. Connolly goes to Dublin in 1896 as a full-time secretary for the Dublin Socialist Society, and very quickly builds that into what he calls a party. It's not really a party, but it's a wide enough grouping, which he calls the Irish Socialist Republican Party, not the Irish Republican Socialist Party, which is a party of a similar name from the 1970s. It was still in existence. What he does in this period is to not only campaign and to organize around the sort of political questions that socialists did, wages, conditions, the nature of local government, standing for elections, standing for the Dublin Corporation. But he also campaigns and argues that socialists should also be concerned with national independence. And so it's this relationship between national independence and socialism that's going to be an important part of his work. He's also involved, although later in really this will be the period between 1910 and 1914 in which this will come out, I think, much more. He's also involved in starting to draw a distinction between what we might think of as fairly moderate reformist socialism, gas and water socialism, the socialism of sort of municipal change and reform. And he's much more drawn towards revolutionary socialism. And indeed, he suggests that much of the approach of many of the dominant socialist groupings was very much not only a compromise with capitalism, but above all a compromise with imperialism. So his focus on the nature of imperialism, and not just simply arguing around economic or political democratic questions, is, I think, going to be an important part of his work. And it's this type of campaigning, particularly, for example, around the centenary of the 1798 United Irish Rising, his agitations around the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, that also bring him into contact with radical nationalist circles. So he does cooperate with radical nationalists in demonstrating against the British imperial rule. But again, he makes great emphasis that these people are essentially representatives of the Irish capitalist class, and that their job is simply to replace the Union flag with the green flag, and that their goals and his goals are, radically different in that way. His agitations, have a certain notoriety, and because they're based in Dublin, they're very much targeted against the local elites, many of whom will be Catholics, they will be, nationalists, they will be people who claim that they want self-government for Ireland. But many of them will also be employers, they will be paying low wages, and they will be, sacking people. And indeed, he famously stands in an election for the council and goes head-to-head with a leading nationalist who is also the author, the writer of a famous song from the period, Bula Vogue, which is a ballad about the 1798 Rising. Now, the names of the individuals and indeed the song are not that important, but what I think this shows is that Connolly is very clearly opposed to, he sees that group, that current in Irish society, as much an enemy, as much an enemy as British imperialism, and that he's not just simply focusing on national hostilities and national divisions. Connolly has also connections with the Independent Labour Party, which does organise in Ireland. Again, comrades who will remember some of our earlier sessions will remember that grouping. And also the Social Democratic Federation, which as I mentioned, had been his sort of first political home in the 1890s. But in 1903, he's involved with a split from the Social Democratic Federation, the Socialist Labour Party. And this grouping will become important. It's influenced very much by the militant trade union or syndicalist politics of Daniel de Leon and many of the American syndicalists, the American militant trade unionists, whose argument is that industrial power and the power of the working class in the workplace will be the way to carry out the socialist revolution. And that indeed the focus on that type of form of workers' power means that what we might think of as largely political activity, standing in elections, advancing political programs, was given much less emphasis. So Connolly, in this period, and indeed from 1906, I think it is when he goes to the United States, he's very clearly linked to this sort of current. He goes to the United States, I think, partly because his efforts in Ireland have not been terribly successful, but also because the United States is developing a very militant labor movement. And one of the things I think comrades, need to understand, it's not necessarily a modern phenomenon, is the relative ease of communications and travel between European countries and the United States. And in particular, the way that the experience of the workers' movement in the United States has its impact in parts of Europe, particularly in the English-speaking countries of Britain and Ireland. So Connolly is very familiar with politics in the United States. He goes there and becomes very quickly involved in the American movement. He becomes involved in various ways. Through syndicalist trade union organization, particularly involved with the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, the Wobblies. But he's also involved with the Socialist Party of America, and also involved in writing and editing newspapers and pamphlets directed at the Irish immigrant population. So his activity in America is very important. And in a way, I think he's attracted to America because it is such a storm center of politics, and particularly that militant trade unionism. And of course, we sometimes think now of America as a country which is dominated by two capitalist parties, that its socialist tradition is either weak or non-existent. But of course, in the early 20th century, it's got an absolutely brilliant and militant socialist tradition. And Connolly, I think, is drawn there, and indeed is very clearly influenced by that. Again, he remains in the United States for a number of years, but in 1910, he comes back to Ireland and becomes involved with a new union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which is starting to organize on quite militant lines, drawing in on some of the politics coming in from the United States, also from France as well. And this new unionism, which has been developing since the late 19th century, organizes groups of workers who were amongst the lowest paid, often very casualized. Dock workers are a good example there. People who are on what we would think of today as 0 hours or very precarious contracts. And they start to organize these groups of workers, the sort of workers who traditionally and historically it would have been very difficult to organize. Indeed, most unions in the 19th century were involved skilled workers who were more stronger position. They had more permanent contracts, higher wages, had a certain bargaining power. So Connolly, along with James Larkin, who was in a sense the guiding spirit of this type of trade unionism, really began to develop the Irish Transport and General Workers Union across the island. Connolly worked initially as an organizer in Belfast, but then came down to Dublin and indeed took part in some of the more militant actions of that union. What's interesting about that union was that it was clearly a militant union, but it also put a great deal of emphasis on solidarity, and by that the development of the sympathetic strike or the idea of boycotting. So that, for example, if a group of workers were on strike, then other groups of workers would not only not do their work, but they would refuse to handle any of the produce of that company. Or indeed, they would come out in sympathetic strike with them. And that tradition of the sympathetic strike, which in some ways is a sort of collective action which comes in from other earlier forms of struggle, was a really strong weapon in the hands of the working class. It wasn't unique to Ireland, it did spread, and indeed in the period of trade union upsurge before the First World War in Britain, it was going to be a really effective weapon. Now, Connolly put a lot of emphasis in this period on trade union organisation, and I would say that his politics at this point could be classified as syndicalist. And by that, as I've referred to before, is the idea that the political party, and indeed political demands as we understand them, would definitely take second place to industrial organisation in the workplace. Indeed, if you read his pamphlet, Socialism Made Easy, he seems to suggest that a socialist society could be developed simply by groups of workers growing in strength and organisation and taking control of their sector of the economy. In other words, that from trade unionism, there would inevitably grow a form of political action that the militant trade unionism would feed over into revolutionary politics. So that the Revolutionary Party, the conception that was developed by other European Marxists, the German Social Democrats, Lenin, Marx as well in an earlier period, was to a certain extent put to one side by Connolly and indeed by Larkin as well. So the focus was on union organisation and on trade union militancy. Now that sort of militancy did win them some gains, but it also represented a real threat to the employers. And in 1913, there was the famous Dublin lockout, in which the employers attempted to effectively crush the Transport and General Workers Union, initially on the trams, but then in other parts of transport and communications. And this again was a real onslaught on the working class. The strike lasted for several months. It was an absolutely horrific strike with great hardship. People were really reduced to quite a low level. There is quite a good dramatization of the strike, both in the form of a novel called Strumpet City, and it's also as a television series, and it really does capture, the sort of sense of real attack by the employing class. The strikers were also attacked by the police. Their meetings were broken up, strikers were killed, and in that way, you get a real sense of a class war. This strike is followed by workers throughout Europe. Workers throughout Europe are looking at this strike as a real example of class war. And of course, the interesting thing about this is that although the state is a British state, the people who are the employers, the people who are launching this attack on the Irish Transport and General Workers Union are in fact Catholic nationalists. William Martin Murphy, the owner of the Irish Independent newspaper, also the Dublin Tramway Company, and a host of other employers. So this earlier point I made about Connolly being critical of middle-class nationalists, bourgeois nationalists, is really brought home by the lockout. Now the lockout is defeated, and indeed in many ways the union is broken, and its organisation is at quite a low ebb. But there are a number of, I suppose, political gains from it. One is, I think, that it does very clearly open up a class division in Irish society, particularly in the urban areas, between the employing class and the working class. In terms of Connolly's own politics and in terms of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union itself, there's also an organisational gain, which is the creation of the Irish Citizen Army. This was originally a group of workers who were trained to protect the picket lines, to protect demonstrations, and after the strike was over, it remained in existence and became, in effect, the first workers' army. Lenin referred to it as the first Red Guard in Europe. The workers were trained in drill, but also in small arms, and indeed would go on to be an important part in both working class and militant struggles in the period up to 1916. So that we have, I think, a growing sense of class division. We also have, in Connolly's case, a clear understanding that the struggle must be conducted in the most militant means possible, and that enemy is not just simply the British state, but the Catholic middle class as well. Connolly, like most left-wing socialists, subscribed to the idea that in an imperialist war, that the workers should have nothing to do with it. And the positions adopted by the 1907 Stuttgart Congress of the Second International, the same 1912 in Basel, took a very militant anti-war position. But as maybe comrades who go to look at Karl Liebknecht later on will tell us, when that war broke out, very few people rallied to the side of that resolution. In other words, very few people took the line that this was a war, an imperialist war, and that the workers should have no part in it. Indeed, across Europe, the workers' movement sided with their own ruling class, and worker went to war with worker. You know, in the famous phrase that a rifle is a weapon with a worker at both ends of it, a worker firing it and a worker as the target of the bullets. So Connolly, like many militant and left socialists, was absolutely distraught at what was happening. And throughout Europe, the left, who had hoped that the war could be stopped by the militant intervention of the working class movement, you know, a very powerful and well-organized movement, particularly in countries like Germany, their hopes were dashed. And this led, I think, many people to, you know, reassess their politics, attempt to understand, you know, what had happened and what sort of perspective they should develop. Now, this is where I think we move into what I think is really quite a significant pattern of developments, which is quite controversial, and in many ways makes Connolly a much more interesting figure than simply, you know, just a great hero, which indeed he is. And this, of course, is the sort of position he takes on the war. Now, he sees the war as an imperialist war. He sees Britain as essentially the aggressor. The British imperialism is fighting German imperialism. But unlike Lenin, and indeed the handful of socialists around Lenin and in Germany, he does not see this war as necessarily an opportunity to launch a civil war, in other words, to turn the war into a revolution. He, you know, in a sense, feels the isolation of the left, and although he sees the war as an opportunity to carry out some form of action, he does not necessarily see this in the same way that Lenin does. Now, why I think this is important, and again, it's, I think, worth discussing after I've finished, is that there have been attempts, you know, and particularly in many of the standard biographies of Connolly, particularly the one by C. Desmond Greaves, to, in a sense, make Connolly into a Leninist. and to argue that the position that Connolly took was that of Lenin, a sort of dual defeatism. So he wishes for the defeat of the Central Powers, Germany and its allies, and he also wishes for the defeat of Britain. I don't think that's the position that Connolly took. Connolly, I think, moves into a much more pro-German position, and in his newspaper, which he now starts to develop as quite explicitly anti-war and particularly anti-British imperialism, the Workers' Republic, he starts, I think, to move towards a much more pro-German position along the lines that German imperialism will be able to smash British imperialism, giving the Irish working class and indeed Ireland a chance to secure its independence. So this is not Lenin's position of dual defeatism. It's clearly not the same position as the British socialists or indeed many of the Irish nationalists who backed the war effort. But it isn't, I think, as clear a revolutionary position as Lenin's. And indeed, I think it starts to move towards a very pro-German position. Indeed, in some of his last articles, it's very clear that he sees German imperialism as having a much more progressive character, and indeed writes that he wished that Ireland had been treated as well as Alsace-Lorraine had been treated by the German Reich, which, given the Saarburn incident of 1913, which sees German troops assaulting civilians in Saarburn, I think probably is something of an overstatement in that way. Also in this period, Connolly does move much more closer towards revolutionary nationalism. And I will emphasize revolutionary nationalism. The people that he previously attacked, the bourgeois nationalists, the middle class nationalists, such as William Martin Murphy, who were very solidly in favor of the war, he continues his hostility to them. But what he does do is now to work much more closely with those more militant Republicans, particularly in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who are now planning a rising during the course of the war. And they're planning this rising in cooperation with Irish American groups and, of course, with Germany. They're in direct contact with Germany. Indeed, one of their leaders, Roger Casement, travels to Germany and attempts to get military assistance. There's quite an interesting diary of Casement's period in Germany, which is well worth reading, talking about his time there. So as the war progresses, Connolly is becoming more and more impatient. And indeed, if anything, he's very much the driving force that persuades the militant nationalists that they must launch a rising. And they do launch a rising at Easter 1916, in April 1916. The rising is a military failure, but I think is going to be much more politically significant. Connolly has an important position in the rising. He's the commandant, the commander of the Irish Citizen Army that takes part in the rising. He's also the commandant of the forces in Dublin itself. Around about 1,500 Irish volunteers and Citizens Army volunteers take over key buildings in Dublin, and the plan is that the rest of the country will rise in their favour. There are some scattered risings in other parts of Ireland, but they don't really amount to much, and the rising is suppressed by British troops and also by artillery, and also the use of a gunboat, the Helga, which comes up the Liffey and bombards the centre of Dublin. If you look at some of the photographs of the period, you'll see that Dublin is pretty well reduced to rubble. And bearing in mind that this is before the age of aerial bombardments from aircraft, it looks like it's been given a fairly heavy going over. Connolly is in many ways responsible for the strategy. There's been much debate about that. Connolly is said to have believed that no capitalist government would bombard Dublin on the grounds that they would destroy property. I have to say I'm skeptical of that. Capitalists will do anything in order to preserve their system. And if it means destroying large parts of the city and their property, I think they will do it. But Connolly was a student of revolutionary warfare in the months leading up to the rising in the Workers' Republic. He prints articles on barricade fighting, and it's very clear that his vision is of an uprising by the population, very similar to the Moscow rising in the 1905 revolution. But that doesn't really happen. The rising is confined to the citizens' army and to the volunteers, and it's indeed crushed. Connolly is wounded in the fighting. Famously, he's unable to stand up. He's in a chair or on a stretcher, and he's sentenced to death along with some of the other leading participants in the rising, who signed the proclamation of the Republic. Connolly is the last one to be executed in May 1916. He's in some ways perhaps the most internationally well-known figure, and many people in Britain would have been familiar with him from the trade union movement, and indeed in speaking tours. And indeed, one of the sort of ironies, although I think it's less an irony and more a treachery, is that one of the members of the cabinet, Arthur Henderson, who's a Labour leader, would have spoken on the same platform as Connolly in some of the strike meetings before 1914, but is now in the cabinet that will execute him. And of course, that shows the real divide between a revolutionary like Connolly and a reformist and indeed essentially a capitalist politician like Henderson. The debate about Connolly and indeed his participation in the rising, and I'll perhaps bring it to a close at this point, is one that I think has gone on for a very long time. Having a Marxist revolutionary as part of a revolutionary nationalist movement has both had certain positive features for Irish revolutionaries and socialists, but also has had some negative elements as well. So, for example, it's very easy, or it's easier, to argue, and this is what many on the left in Ireland have done, that socialism is not some foreign import, that it's not, for example, the product of atheistic communism from the Eastern Bloc, that Connolly is a native Irish person and therefore it's native to Ireland. So the presence of Connolly in the Easter Rising does legitimate militant socialism, and indeed virtually every left grouping in Ireland, from the Irish Labour Party leftwards, makes some claims to be continuing the ideas of Connolly. There's also another element, I suppose, which is that it also rather domesticates and tames Connolly. Like all good dead revolutionaries, there is a railway station named after him, some blocks of flats, and a hospital, and a few other roads, and so on and so forth. So in that way, he's been sort of incorporated into official Irish society. His participation in the rising was controversial at the time. Some people on the European left criticized him for participating in essentially a nationalist uprising, and both Karl Radek and Leon Trotsky wrote that really nationalism as a progressive force in Ireland was finished, and that although they acknowledged Connolly's bravery, they thought that the tragedy was that the Irish proletariat had risen too soon. Lenin didn't take that view. Lenin supported the rising and made the point that the rising was not just simply a minority, that it represented wider social forces, and that indeed, socialists should support, an anti-imperialist struggle in that way. But perhaps more importantly, the real debate was on the strategy that the Irish left should adopt and their relationship towards the national movement. The line that Connolly took, I think, was broadly followed by the left, with many people arguing that the struggle for national independence, the struggle against imperialism, was an important struggle. But there were differing interpretations about how far this should involve both compromises with bourgeois nationalists and perhaps also compromises with other elements in Irish society. Connolly, as an individual, was a Marxist, but he did make certain concessions, both in his writings and indeed, I think, in some aspects of his public practice towards Catholicism. So in some ways, he sort of posed as a fairly conventional Catholic, when in practice he said that he wasn't. So in some of his writings, he tends to be less critical of aspects of Catholicism, and indeed, I think his attempts to build on Catholicism as a way of drawing people towards socialism. You may argue that that is a legitimate idea, but it, in some instances, I think does tend to blur distinctions, and also I think does tend to make concessions towards nationalism. I think the other element that's important for Connolly is simply that he is a working class figure. Many of the figures that we look at in this series are committed revolutionaries and socialists, but not all of them come from the working class itself. And Connolly is a good example of what a worker can achieve, but also that commitment to struggle, that commitment towards self-education and political development. Connolly is effectively self-taught. He did learn some German and was familiar with some of the main writings of German socialists. And I think his great gift was his ability to translate revolutionary politics into quite direct and clear language. Some of the first socialist pamphlets I read were by Connolly in the late 1960s. And the force and the power of them still stays with me even now in that way. I also think, though, that many of his later followers, and particularly in the War of Independence that was to follow, tended to subordinate working class struggle. And indeed, in the famous phrase of Eamon de Valera, "Labour must wait," they tended, in a sense, to just sublimate their struggle. And there were numerous examples of militant working class struggle in this period. And the fact that it was subordinated, or the leaders tended to just simply go in behind militant nationalism, I think, again, shows that this legacy, is not unequivocal. But as I've said, his inspiration, I think, is important. He remains a figure that we should look at and consider, not in that sort of way of thinking, what would Connolly do today? Or even in that rather, unhistorical way of looking back on the past and, maybe thinking, oh, we should have done this or we should have done that. That's bad enough when it comes to a football match. But in terms of politics, we can point out the mistakes, but we also need to understand the sort of pressures and, the real situation that our comrades in the past were in. So an inspiring figure, an important figure, and also not one that's uncontroversial. His legacy is still debated, and indeed, even just this year, there's been another sort of outbreak of debate on the nature of his politics and his wider political significance. So there you are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think that's a very good critical look. I mean, we do learn from these socialists in our history, but not we should never do so in an uncritical way and just, hero worship them. And I think you made a very good assessment of his strengths and some of his perhaps weaknesses. Comrades, if you want to ask a question or come in to make a contribution, please raise your hand and we can bring you in. To get the ball rolling, I got a few questions for you. Firstly, can you switch the light on in your room? You're moving back and forth, and you're very dark, and then you get light again, but it's in general a bit dark. I'm very interested in this position where you're saying he took a quite a pro-German position as opposed to Lenin and Luxembourg and a handful of socialists who had an internationalist position in the run-up to the First World War. It did really split the left quite dramatically. Then most people folded one way or another. Most socialists, of course, sided with their own side, with their own government, and felt the need to support their own government. So Connolly, you say, sort of sided with the Germans. Is it because he, just purely from a, I'm an Ireland, or I fight for Ireland, and the Germans are fighting the Irish, and I want the Irish government to lose? Or did he see it like perhaps some people see it on the left today, in the Ukraine war? I mean, it's quite different, but you have the big imperialist country and the smaller one, and some think they have to side with the smaller one. We have to support Russia against NATO, Ukraine, etc., because Russia isn't quite as bad. Whereas I think real internationalist socialists would say we don't support either. Yeah, that's I'll leave that question there for now. Second one, I was really interested in the Easter Rising. Did it ever have a chance of succeeding, or was it sort of born out of revolutionary impatience, perhaps? And was it a little bit like the German Revolution, perhaps? Where you had, of course, there was a movement, and there was something happening from below, but it didn't actually translate into the kind of movement that we saw in Russia in 1918, where really a majority wanted to change things and wanted to get involved, and where you understand why people took action and started a revolutionary uprising, but it was never very likely to succeed? Or do you think the Easter Rising actually did have a chance of inspiring the majority of the working class in Ireland, or the people to come up? That's two questions. Do you want me to bring in Steve, who's got his hand up, or do you want to answer them first?
I'll answer them, Tina, because I'll only forget. Yeah. Connolly's pro-Germanism is interesting, and because it's developing during the war, I think it's hard to exactly explain, other than I think his sense that Germany is the weaker imperialism. It's the one that's under attack. And it may well be very much a case of England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. I think, though, that does move towards a perhaps more, if I say pro-Germanism, I'm going on the basis of articles in his newspaper, The Workers' Republic. But these are not really very developed ideas. They're written under a bit of censorship, and I think the better way is to explain that he's in despair to a certain extent about what has happened to the international working class, and wants to strike a blow back against imperialism. and sees it in that way. I think some of the pro-Germanism are a little bit sort of throwaway lines. It's clearly there, and I mentioned the reference to Alsace because he contrasts. Alsace is technically a Reichsland, a sort of protectorate. It's not annexed to any one of the German states. It's actually under the direct control of the empire. And he sort of says that that the people in Alsace are treated very well. And I mentioned the Saarburn incident in 1913, which shows that it isn't like that. So I think that does show some sort of political confusion, but it's still at an early stage, and it may well be that he would have developed in a different way if, for example, he'd been more closely in contact with German and Russian socialists in that way. As far as we can tell, he was getting some information from the United States, but he was not, for example, aware of things like Zimmerwald, much of which occurred after the Rising anyway. And so in that sense, I think he's cut off there. On the Easter Rising itself, it was criticized as a putsch. You may remember that the other year with the events in January the 6th, there was quite a debate on the left about the nature of a putsch. He was criticized for that, particularly by Radek, and I think to a certain extent by Trotsky. The arguments of the revolutionary nationalists were those that if the Rising wasn't launched, then that essentially the population in Ireland would become reconciled to British rule, that this was almost the last chance in that way. I think his hope was that the militant struggles of the Dublin working class and some of the peasants' movements could be fused together. Again, there are some signs that could have occurred, and perhaps more importantly, in the period after 1918, you do get that sort of fusion of a mass movement of the population for political independence with some sort of social change. That would seem to suggest that the potential was there, and that it may have been in one sense premature, but it wasn't in a sense completely unrealistic. But it's clear that as an actual rising itself, the Rising was largely confined to Dublin, and it was predicated in many ways. It was predicated on a sort of conspiratorialism. I mean, I won't go into the great details of this, but the various volunteers were called out on manoeuvres, and the expectation was that they would carry out their manoeuvres, occupy certain buildings, and then someone would say, oh, by the way, this is an uprising. And so the sort of preparation of the sort you're describing from the Bolsheviks, or indeed the German Revolution, I think was not as present. The Irish Citizen Army did prepare. I mean, it was very clear when you read the Workers' Republic. I bought the facsimile papers in 2016, and they are fascinating because he runs a series from January called Revolutionary Warfare, saying, like, if you have a revolution, this is how you do it. And it's sort of done as a series of lessons. So it's fairly plain. I mean, they're forever carrying out maneuvers in Dublin. And I remember they're going around with guns. I mean, they're not just, they're openly parading with weapons, and their famous slogan, we serve neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland. So the British authorities are very aware that something is coming. But I think the political preparation, could have been deeper and wider. But we're now starting to get into the what if score. Yeah, and also, Tina, just one point for you. I'm afraid the Germans really ruined their chances there, because if they'd taken it more seriously, they could have they could have, I mean, it may well have been difficult to land an expeditionary force, but it certainly could have posed a real military threat, which one of my students who did work in the Imperial Naval Archive, which I think is somewhere down in southwestern Germany, Friedrichshafen or somewhere like that, Ludwigshafen somewhere, and they're forever rueing the fact that they could actually have had a nice base in Ireland. Anyway, that's what, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Aaron, next time. Yeah. Thanks for that. Steve, please.
Hi, Tina, and hi, Kevin. Kevin. Thank you very much for that talk. It was an excellent talk, and I think you covered all the points I could think of. I just want to maybe emphasize a couple of things, because I think that Connolly was basically on the right lines, and I'll say why I think that was. But I think it's that the significance, I think, is his strategy is still relevant today, I would argue. So what was interesting about Connolly, I think, was because of the national question, Connolly was forced by that, the existence of the national question island, to address political and constitutional issues. In other words, that socialism wasn't just simply equated with trade unionism. The national question meant you had to deal with the question of democracy and the government of Ireland. And that was made so important. And that made the kind of Marxism that Connolly had a kind of political Marxism. And in that sense, much closer, therefore, to Lenin's political Marxism, as you remember that Lenin was campaigning against the economists that he thought were completely wrong. So you could call Connolly a Marxist, you could call him a syndicalist, you could clearly call him a revolutionary, but I think we have to call him a Republican socialist, in the sense that the struggle for democracy and against national oppression meant that the idea of a Republican socialism meant a Republican road to socialism. In other words, the Republic was merely a step to the social revolution. And that you could see that as an application of the idea of permanent revolution. In other words, the first step was only the first step, and you had to carry on. If you achieved a republic, you had to continue with the process. And you could see 1916 as the first Republican uprising during the First World War. And the second, of course, was February 1917. And then, of course, October 1917, the process carried on. Thinking it, therefore, as the process of permanent revolution means that the revolution is ongoing. And that means what's going on here is not a peculiarity of the Irish or indeed of the Russians. It's relevant, I would argue, today. The Republican road to socialism is as relevant in England as it was in Ireland. And I think that's the essence of Connolly's Republican socialism, is that he saw the importance of the independence of the working class, not to merge, that was the whole trick, not to merge with the bourgeoisie. That's why the citizens' army is so important in that idea. In that sense, that's why Lenin was the one that recognized that what they did in Dublin in 1916 was not a putsch. It might look like a putsch, but it was the first step in building an Irish revolution. And that's why, the way you formulated it, although the putsch was crushed, it was only the beginning of a process. And you couldn't really crush that movement. It was really, in a sense, a spark, actually, a spark for what was to come later in 1918 and 1919 in Ireland. It was just, therefore, if it had just been a putsch, we'd have heard no more about it after they were crushed, but it wasn't. It was part of a political process in Ireland that created the Irish Revolution of 1919 to 22. So I'll finish on this point, Tina and Kevin. I think Connolly is still very relevant today. I think he's relevant in what we have to understand, the political task for today, which is to understand what a Republican road to socialism looks like in this country in the here and now.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it, Kevin? Was it a spark, the Easter Rising?
Yeah, sorry, that's right. Yeah. Yes, I think that it is, and I think that's why I don't see it as a putsch. I think that it is, I think Steve described parts of it quite well, in particular that it does trigger those later events, and it in a sense is sort of drawing on what we might think of as subterranean processes. One of the things that Irish historians in the generality are interested in is the impact of the Rising, and there is a sort of conventional view that the Rising, the rather harsh treatment, sort of triggered widespread revulsion. But and that's true, but it's also clear from other evidence that in the months leading up to 1916, that there is growing unrest in Ireland, and that social economic discontent is rising as well. So in that way, I think it does sort of channel and bring the forces together. I think Steve is also right in terms of the national question, that it's one that can't be ignored. And one of the things that some of Connolly's critics, particularly those who argued that nationalism or political democracy was something of a diversion, and that militant trade unionism or simple class economic politics were sufficient, was the fact that the national oppression of Ireland was linked to the nature of British imperialism. So although Connolly himself, whilst in the United States in particular, I think did imbibe a degree of syndicalism, I think that when he came back to Ireland, he then added the focus on Irish national independence and political democracy, and so he did, move in the direction that Steve says. However, one of the things I do think we have to be careful with him, and this is why I think we should actually read what he said, and we should look at his work, and I know that Steve has done that. But he is, he's developing his ideas. He's a political activist. He's a writer, and he is, he's not simply writing agitational material. But I think that his politics was still in the process of development, and I think it would have been interesting to see how he would have developed if he'd been in contact with people who were putting forward that idea of international revolution. So I think that Connolly's focus on the war against imperialism, and above all the independence of the working class, because the great tragedy was that most of the people who claimed to follow him, particularly in the Labour Party, which he had a part in founding, simply tailed behind the bourgeois nationalism of Sinn Féin. His sons and other followers would later go on to become quite important, both in Irish socialism and would also have an influence in the British movement as well. So he did, I think, keep alive a tradition, and he did pass something on. But I think it was incomplete. It was in the process of development. And why I want to emphasize that is that Desmond Greaves and a number of other writers, in trying to Leninize Connolly, have often sort of distorted his politics, and they've often sort of fitted him into a particular model. Just as the way that people in the old East Germany did the same thing with Rosa Luxemburg, and that's why I say go back and read what Connolly actually wrote, and you can see the various influences and currents, and you can then make an argument about how important they were in that way. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Ian Spencer, please.
Good evening, comrades. Greetings from County Durham. Could I just put forward the proposition that the Easter Uprising was a debacle, and actually Connolly should have known better. It was a debacle in terms of its organisation and execution, and if he... Oh. Did you hear that, or was I muted?
Yeah, all good. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, no, I can hear you. Yeah.
And if he'd actually been the Marxist that he's supposed to be, and we can forgive him a lot. I mean, for me as a 13-year-old member of the Connolly Association, for Connolly represented the I mean, let's put it bluntly, I mean, Britain has never really produced any decent Marxist theorists. And Connolly there was not only a theorist, but also an activist par excellence. But I think if we learn any lessons, it's what happens when you throw your lot in with nationalists. How many communists have died in the last 100 years because they've thrown their lot in with nationalists on the grounds that, oh, this is somehow a progressive step forward. We all know where two-stage revolutions lead, don't we? And where it came from. Back to Connolly. I can only imagine the horror, the disappointment, of seeing people collude with imperialist governments and all the rest of it. And the feeling that you have to then go with what you've got, as it were, must have been overpowering. But that highlights the problem. That's exactly what we should learn from. The idea that somehow we should support one imperialism against another is exactly the kind of disaster that Connolly has taught us not to do. We can't say, for example, that it was really the nationalists that wanted, as it were, a blood sacrifice. And that tells you all you need to know. What was the outcome? The idea that Connolly had any popular support, whether in Dublin or elsewhere. There were people booing and throwing stuff at them when they were led off to Kilmainham jail, because there was very little support at the time. The utter brutality of the British state in executing these poor people was the thing that really galvanized support. And so the idea of, is that what we stand for, a blood sacrifice? Just imagine if he'd done it a year later. Now, never mind Trotsky, just imagine if he'd done it a year later. It could have been a spark. Instead, it was a damp squib. Instead, it was an absolute disaster. And what did it lead to? An Irish Free State, the only country ever to send an international brigade to go and fight for Franco. I mean, for goodness sake, an appraisal of the forces around you must include the nature of the type of nationalist. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment Connolly didn't understand that, but nevertheless, it was clearly a misjudgment throwing his lot with these people. It was, I mean, and to sacrifice the best militants on an altar of nationalism must be regarded as, well, proof positive how praxis is our laboratory. It was a disaster, and it's worth remembering as a disaster and something we can learn from. And that takes nothing away for the indomitable courage of Comrade Connolly. And that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
That's all you have to say. So, interesting contribution. Yes, thank you. Kevin, do you want to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think you put forward a view which has grown in strength in recent years. I disagree about the spark question, and I think that there is evidence from the Royal Irish Constabulary reports about feeling in the country in the years leading up to 1916, which do indicate that a movement is building. And indeed, I think hostility to both conscription and to the war effort is a factor. So the idea that it was a waste, or in a sense it was at the wrong time. I mean, the timing of an insurrection is a difficult one. It's an art, not a science. But I disagree that it was simply the executions. I think that there is a movement building beforehand in that way. Connolly, I think, was not so hooked up on blood sacrifice. I know that Sean O'Casey in The Plough and the Stars and other places criticizes that particular view, and indeed Connolly himself is critical of it. He's critical of some of the things that Pierce writes. I think he described some of them as the work of a blithering idiot. And I'm not convinced that he does see it in terms of blood sacrifice. I think he does think that it may have a chance, or it may be, you know, something of a catalyst in that way. You know, the incidents that you referred to of their treatment when they're being led away, I mean, there's a considerable debate about this, partly because they're led through particular districts of Dublin where large numbers of people are in the British Army or their husbands are, and the so-called separation women, the people getting income. It is a sort of popular saw that they were ill-treated as they were led away, and that this shows the unpopularity. But there was other evidence of a degree of sympathy. But again, we're exactly gauging that, I think, is difficult. I also am not entirely, I mean, I agree that the Rising is militarily quite incompetent, although, again, I'm sure you're aware of the circumstances, the various countermanding orders, the nature of the Rising. But I actually think that as a plan, it might have stood some chance of success if the elements were there. You might well argue that it was foolhardy to go ahead when some of the elements were missing. But the other possibility would have been simply to have awaited arrest and, possibly, long-term imprisonment or even execution. But I think the events after 1916 demonstrate that this movement does exist, that it's there in embryo, and that it will pick up. You know, Sinn Féin, standing on the programme of independence, start to win by-elections. The anti-conscription movement, the general strike in 1918, all show, a degree of militancy. And I don't see that as simply, unrelated to the Rising. I see it as a product of a process. But, your view is not a minority one. It I think has a degree of support, but I still see it as part of a wider process. I think where the problem of the nature of the type of nationalists, and you do put your finger on that, is that Connolly did understand it. I mean, famously, he told William O'Brien that if we succeed in this Rising, hold on to your guns, because we've got different enemies than the bourgeois nationalists have. But I think it's again looking at the role of an insurrection, and also the role of that type of militant policy during such a calamitous world war. Now, people like Desmond Greaves, and you referred to the Connolly Association, which I also had some teenage affiliations to, would have argued that that the Rising was perhaps the first in a chain of international risings, and that, they would have Leninized Connolly. I don't think he quite saw it like that, but he did see the need to strike a blow, and I don't see that as a blood sacrifice. I see it as a political action. But anyway, we'll perhaps return to this. But your comments are, I think, you put them quite forcefully, and I think they do represent a particular view, particularly the critique that people like Sean O'Casey made of both Connolly's alliance with revolutionary nationalists, and also the nature of the Free State that turned out, that the radical left elements, that if Connolly had stayed alive, the argument would be that he would have been in a position to shape that new state and that new society. I'm not convinced of that, but we'll perhaps return to that.
Thanks for replying, Kevin. Tony, please.
Yeah, I mean, national oppression is a form of class oppression. The question really is who leads the struggle, and Connolly put his finger on it in so many ways, and it's been a dilemma, and it's been a problem ever since. because we've seen numerous movements for colonial liberation in Africa, Asia, and so on. And in all of them, without exception, that includes the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. It is, if you like, the petty bourgeois and bourgeois elements of that liberation struggle which have risen to the fore and which have garnered the benefits, whereas the position of ordinary Africans has often deteriorated. It hasn't actually prospered. That what they've gained is a national flag and a national anthem. But Connolly certainly represented, as Steve said, if you like, permanent revolution and the ideas of permanent revolution. But I wanted to really just touch on one or two other things. I mean, Connolly also, I mean, he didn't have in the benefit of hindsight as to when the Easter Rising took place. I mean, it's easy for us to look back and say, well, it should have taken place later rather than sooner, but that wasn't a luxury that they had, unfortunately. But what Connolly did do is he foresaw the movement for partition, and he was quite clear about that partition of Ireland would lead to a carnival reaction, as he put it, on both sides of the border, and he was absolutely right about that. And we see that today. As regards his sympathy for German imperialism, I suggest really that was the typical reaction often of nationalists to their own national oppressor. I mean, we saw that in the Second World War in India, Subhash Chandra Bose, and in Burma and elsewhere, where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I suspect Connolly actually knew very little about the operation of German imperialism in, for example, Southwest Africa with the genocide of the Herero people, the extermination camp at Shark Island, and so on. So it was really an instinctive reaction. If you look to Alsace-Lorraine, that probably was the most benevolent example of the operation of German imperialism, and I don't think one can really fault him for that lack of knowledge. But what I did want to ask Kevin was, if it's correct that the survivors of the Easter Rising, when they were led through the streets, were spat on and reviled, and then, of course, the British executed them one by one. Do you think, in hindsight, that British imperialism made a serious strategic blunder in the way they handled that? And did that, in fact, lead, in the end, to their downfall?
Let's do a bit of hindsight, after all. Kevin.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, I mean, your point about national and class oppression is well made, and why I stress that Connolly really did launch into a critique of bourgeois nationalism from the 1890s was that he did so at a period when there was a sort of pan-nationalism was developing. And in particular, why I mentioned Boule Vogue and the centenary of 1798 was that, as is the way, the constitutional nationalists acquired the sort of aura of the revolution by annexing the revolutionary tradition, whether it be the Fenians or the United Irishmen, and saying, of course, that sort of struggle isn't necessary anymore, and sort of wrapping the green flag around them and emphasizing that you know, we could adopt other methods. Now home rule would bring us the future. So Connolly's, you know, refusal to do that and to point towards the class relationships between Irish capitalism and British capitalism, I think is absolutely crucial, because, you know, you've made the point quite well that the type of, you know, the comparison with South Africa, you know, the revolution, the Irish Revolution did not carry out widespread land reform. Many of the more militant members of the IRA had to either emigrate, partly because in the Civil War they'd lost, and then they lost their jobs and so on, but simply because the new state was unable to you know, feed and clothe its people, you know. So the new state was in many senses you know, as reactionary as Connolly was afraid it was going to be. But of course the whole point was that the enemy was now clear, in that way, and that you were fighting against against an Irish capitalist class who had pretended to be Irish allies of yours beforehand. The point about the carnival reaction, I think, is important, and Connolly did put a lot of emphasis on that. He also, I think, failed, though, to see the role of both the British state in partition, and perhaps more importantly, the acquiescence of many people in the British Labour movement. He was increasingly disillusioned with the leadership of that movement, and I remember, I mean, this is a very long time ago. It may be more than 50 years ago now. Hearing an old associate of Connolly's. Old men like you and I, Tony, are old enough to have been around when there were still people who were only in their 60s and 70s who would have known Connolly and fought alongside him. But he did expect and did hope that in Britain, for example, that maybe some of the more militant elements in Scotland might well have taken strike action and indeed carried out solidarity action with the rising. And I think, that was going to come, and that did come a little later on, as we say, with the luxury of hindsight. In some ways, his policies remind me of some of the Polish socialists in some of their reactions to the imperialist powers. And again, it's possibly understandable, and indeed, given the way that today in imperialistic wars people take sides, or they always want to back one side or the other, then Lenin's specific dual defeatism was, I think, an unusual position, and in that way, Connolly, I think, had not really stepped into that type of space. I'm sure again that if he'd lived longer and had been in touch with anti-war movements, then I think he might well have developed different politics in that way. The question of the executions, a bit like Ian's comments, is in some ways sort of impossible really to really to separate. Why I mention the intelligence reports is that the British were concerned increasingly from 1915 that the Irish population were not only not in favor of the war, but were sort of growing more militant. And there is evidence that militant nationalism was certainly, a feature in the rural areas. So, if we see the rising as coming on the back of, growing alienation, particularly from the war, then maybe the executions, do add a quality development. What I don't see it happening is a sort of sympathy vote, that the executions suddenly make people realize what an oppressive government they have. It's certainly clear that it doesn't help, and it is, I think, in many ways very much a miscalculation. On the other hand, and I'm not defending British imperialism, but I am explaining it. What you're dealing with here is an armed insurrection which is supported by the enemy in the midst of a world war. This is not a bit of a fight, in the centre of Dublin. It's a serious attempt. The Germans do send an armament shipment. Casement does arrive back in Ireland from Germany in a submarine. And it is in a period in which the British are not in a particularly good position in the war. There is also some evidence that the Germans did carry out some attacks on the east coast of England with battleships as a sort of diversionary attack. So, in other words, for many in the British forces, this was not just you know, a minor skirmish. It was a serious challenge. And also, I think symbolically, you know, they would have to deal with it. You know, they would have to see it as a challenge because of those other movements that you referred to. If they were lenient in Ireland, then the Egyptians, the Egyptians, the Indians, and so on would take lessons from that, as indeed they did later on, when you know, the revolutionary period it ushers in, and this is a sort of source of lessons for other people. So I think the rising is important, but I think that it's that sort of dramatic turning point. You know, the Yeats poem tends to, you know, talk about a terrible beauty. You know, all changed utterly. Pardon me. Does tend to sort of focus on this, and I think it clearly happens, but I don't think it comes out of nowhere. And the fact that there's a new, younger generation coming along, emigration to the United States has stopped. Many young people are afraid of being conscripted into the army. The war is going badly. It does give a different feeling. The anti-conscription movement in Ireland was of a different character than in England, and it gives a real impetus towards the Sinn Féin election victory in, well, the by-election victories initially, and then the general election at the end of 1918.
Thanks, Kevin. The last person from the floor now is Victor. If anybody else has a question, I would like to make a comment, please click raise hand or put your question in the Q&A, please.
Thank you very much, Tina. And thank you, Kevin, for a very scholarly discourse. I hope you're...
Comrade, I don't think your internet is good enough, I'm afraid. Victor, you're breaking up. We can't really hear you. Sorry. You're really breaking up. Sorry, comrade. Okay, we've had a few more people indicate quickly. Okay, let's bring...
You know, if you just ask Victor to maybe type it in, and I could refer to it as summing up.
Yes, Victor, if you want to type your question in the Q&A or in the questions in the chat, we can pass it on to Kevin. Harry, please.
Yeah, hiya, comrades. I mean, I think there's lessons to be learnt in the 16 Rising that are as true today, and lessons that I think need to be learnt today as well. The 16 Rising, which, as already explained, was a nationalist movement, did have achievements in the end, in the sense that it drove out the influence of British imperialism, the land question. It drove out the landlords. But the consequences of that was the partition of Ireland. And I think the mistake that Connolly made was not to subsequently address the north of Ireland, particularly the Protestants in the north of Ireland. And I think if you look at many of his writings, it's probably absent of any strategic strategy to win over the Protestants in the north of Ireland. Of course, British imperialism exploited this through Lloyd George, the UVF, Loyalist paramilitaries, Carson, and so on. It was open for the division of Ireland. Now, I think the problem from the outset, as Kevin explained, Lenin did support the uprising, premature as it was, as Lenin actually said. But I think what was missing is when you move into, as Connolly did, with the Citizens' Army and the IRB, you have a nationalist movement and a nationalist agenda. And in order to really move onto a socialist program, what was missing was very much the labor movement. Now, the labor movement made strategic failures, particularly in the 1918, when they set back and did nothing. Of course, Connolly wasn't around, And indeed, when it led to partition, of course, Connolly wasn't around either. But I think he would have been in a very weak position to intervene in that period. The labour and the trade union movement did not intervene in this period, and they were the decisive force to intervene, unite people onto a socialist programme. And that, I think, was the great mistake and the great failure after that has led to today. Just finally, the mistakes are still being made today in the trade union movement, is they're looking at a nationalist approach to this and not an approach to unify people under a socialist programme and to move forward on the nationalist question in a unified manner. And we talked today about border polls, nationalist movements, nationalist majorities. No, the mistake is still being made today within the trade union movement. And it's an approach on the socialist basis, on an agenda of agreement, that can only resolve unity of Ireland under a socialist programme.
Okay, Harry. Kevin. Thank you.
Sorry, comrades, I've got a bit of a sore throat at the moment, so the voice is a bit it's a bit ropey. I've taken a lozenge, so I hope you'll hold out. Yeah. I wouldn't agree with Harry about the landlords. I mean, landlordism was in many ways destroyed by earlier struggles, and in fact, the British government had introduced some land reforms under pressure in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And in fact, much of the power of the Anglo-Irish landlords had been weakened, but what was strengthened would have been the Irish strong farmers, indeed the Irish landlordism. You know, in that sense, it was less, as Connolly said, it was less, you know, getting rid of landlordism as getting, you know, ones with green flags in that way. So, you know, in that way, you know, British imperialist rule was weakened, but I think British imperialism still continued to dominate in the South. And indeed, I would say that it isn't really up until the late 70s that British Irish capitalism starts to sort of chart any sort of path away from that. But, you know, that's really another question, I think. I think the issue that Harry raises is actually quite a fundamental one, and maybe it would be worth looking at in terms of the debate on the border and the border poll and so on, maybe a little time in the autumn when maybe around the time that the census data comes out in that way, in later in the autumn. I think the question of winning over the Protestants is I suppose a great debate. Connolly, I think, looked at the Protestant population in two ways. I think first of all he saw the possibilities that the class militancy might fracture the cross-class alliance that existed within unionism. And Harry, if you remember, he says that the grandchildren of the Ulster Unionists will laugh at them when they talk about what you did to resist home rule. In other words, he sees them as very much sort of paper tigers in that way. But I think what we have to recognize is that large sections of the unionist population, you know, not all sections of the unionist population, you know, there are many brave Protestant workers who end up in the Lagan or have rivets thrown at them, or even worse, are just driven out of Belfast altogether for being rotten prods because they don't fall into line with this sectarian politics. But that large sections of the Protestant population are effectively allied to a section of British imperialism, particularly around the Conservative Party and that sort of military, industrial, agricultural complex. I think the idea that they could have been one other than, and that Ireland could have been liberated other than in a revolutionary way, tends to downplay that. It tends to overstate, I think, the ability of economic politics, economism, to detach them. And I think that, you know, in a sense, they were clearly part of a unionist bloc, as indeed many of them were going to remain, you know, throughout the time of the Northern Ireland state's existence. And I think, again, it's, you know, the labour movement, socialists have to explain to them and have to campaign, but have to point out the relationship between national and class questions in that way. And so the idea that they could be won over, I think is largely illusory. Not saying that certain of them couldn't be, but I think that type of politics tends to downplay the nature of the unionist bloc, and in particular the structures that developed in the north of Ireland in that way. But where I would agree with you, Harry, is that the current focus on the border poll, and particularly the reunification of Ireland in that way, it offers really nothing for either Protestant and Catholic workers, and also I think offers very little for the inhabitants of the southern state. So I'm in favour of Irish reunification, but I'm not in favour of us simply tagging behind what Dublin governments and bourgeois politicians in the north do. You know, I think that's to be an independent working class position, which is for reunification, you know, but on a very different basis. But as I say, that's you know, that's a question that we can maybe pursue in the autumn, when I think it will reoccur again.
Thanks, Kevin. Last person on the floor is Ken. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kevin. To an extent, you've sort of partly addressed this question already in one of your previous answers, when you said that after his death, his sons and followers tried to continue his ideas to a level. What I'm interested in is the extent to which the Marxist elements in his ideas survived after his death, and to what extent, in effect, his legacy was hijacked by the nationalists. So I'd be interested in your views on that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And perhaps, Kevin, we could sort of use that as a summing up question. That was the last comment from the floor. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, and thanks, comrades. Some very interesting comments, and I think many of the views on Connolly, which are sort of in wider circulation, you know, have been expressed tonight. So I'd like to thank those comrades, even the ones that, you know, either didn't agree with or didn't answer properly, as far as they were concerned, because I think we've sort of seen, you know, all the facets of Connolly in that way. I referred to the fact that Connolly, like many of the 1916 leaders, is a very useful symbol. You know, I do remember 1966, the 50th anniversary, which I actually spent some time in Ireland. I was actually at school for a brief time around then in Ireland. And the sort of hagiography of Connolly or Pearse and so on, you know, completely removed, you know, the reality of their ideas, both the positive and the negative. So as I said, Connolly was good enough to have a hospital, a block of flats and a railway station named after him. But the real things that he stood for were obviously completely, you know, ignored or indeed played down. The legacy of Connolly for the Irish left, you know, has been valuable. It means that he does, you know, give guidance, as it were, about how we might understand the national question and how we might orientate towards it. But also because of the ambiguities of much of what he wrote, and indeed, more importantly, the way that subsequent people on the left tended, for example, to downplay the importance of an independent, distinctive working class position, meant that many of them simply followed on behind forms of bourgeois nationalism. So that I think that the ambiguities, and above all the sort of different contexts which might explain Connolly's policy, then becomes a sort of general blanket rule. It means that Connolly is also used by different people in different ways. A speaker at a Sinn Féin Ardèche in 1980-81 refers to the way that Connolly would have been on the side of the Afghan guerrillas fighting the Soviet army. But then there will be others who would say that Connolly would have been on the side of the Soviet army fighting against the Afghan guerrillas. So you can see that he becomes infinitely flexible in that way. And I think some of that is just that he like all of us, he died at a certain point, and later politics, and particularly the sort of politics that Lenin and others put forward, which he would have oriented towards, he may have rejected, he may have gone in another direction. We don't know. We can't say. We can't. We can't tell that. But in a way, we're looking at him in a sense always with hindsight in that way. I think the other thing that he was very influential in was clearly establishing the idea that socialism and indeed radical politics were not simply an alien import. So that when in the 1890s, when socialists are starting to develop in Ireland, or indeed when militant trade unionism is starting to pick up in the years 1910 to 14, the accusations often thrown at both Connolly and Larkin, Larkin that he's from Liverpool and Connolly that he's from Edinburgh, both of them speak, Connolly always had a Scottish accent to the end of his days, and Larkin's accent was a sort of Dublin, Liverpool. But what they were able to demonstrate in their own writing and their own activity was that militant socialism, and militant working class politics was as deeply rooted in Ireland as elsewhere, and that indeed even in an ostensibly pious country, that those class politics could be the basis for political movements. I think also what's come out of the discussion is that Connolly is a very contested figure, and rather like Rosa Luxemburg's another one, is not somebody that we can simply put into a little box and in a sense sanitize or just make hagiographical analyses of. Lots of people would like to do that with Connolly. The Southern government would like to just have him as a rather idealistic socialist, bit impractical, but he was basically on the right side. Others would like to see him as being a sort of Lenin figure who, because it's important to ally yourself with world communism, then he's got to be exactly like Lenin. And so you cut and paste his remarks, and you turn him into something that he clearly wasn't. His politics were evolving, and they had all sorts of rough edges. But the thing that I found inspiring, and I go back to what I said right at the beginning, was that he is an authentic working class leader. He has all the strengths and weaknesses of the working class movement. And what he proves is that the leaders of our movement can come, from all classes, and are capable of great determination, of great courage, and of great sacrifice, but above all of taking ownership of Marxism, of socialist ideas, and explaining and putting those ideas out to masses of people who can then be won over. And and Connolly is a past master at that, and someone whose work is still important to study to see how we can do that. So thanks, comrades.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think that was a really good summing up here. All the strengths and all the weaknesses of the whole of the working class. We can learn from people, even if we critically, evaluate, reevaluate some of their more problematic views, etc. But they're still one of ours. Comrades, if you want to introduce a person from our history, somebody who's inspired you, somebody you've come across, or even somebody that you don't know that much about, but actually want to learn more about, and in the process could educate us as well, it'd be much appreciated if you could drop us an email, info@labourleft.org, and you can do a session. It doesn't have to be as good as Kevin's session. Don't worry, nobody's as good as our Kevin, and the session on Connolly Plit is not going to be that great. But I think it's good for comrades to learn themselves as well, and to look into people of our history and reclaim them and learn from them and critically evaluate them. Thanks very much, comrades, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Kevin, and we'll see you next week with Sandy McBurney introducing, who's he introducing? Kevin, remind me.
John McLean.
John McLean, that's the one. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.